cognitive development. The cognitive approach really focuses on the cognition and thought and our conscious thought and how that plays a part in constructing our knowledge and understanding. Two theorists that we are revisiting are Jean Piaget and Lev Vygotsky. Under the scope of the cognitive approach, the key ideas are understanding how knowledge is constructed. When we look at Jean Piaget, we looked at some of his thoughts before with assimilation and accommodation. Now we're going to look at his cognitive development theory. And he really talks about children taking that active role in their learning. And when we look at his 4 stages of cognitive development, he actually moves throughout the early years of development, or that early childhood education phase where we do say birth to 12 years. So he starts with sensory motor, so that's the 0 to 2, pre-operational stage, 2 to 7, concrete operational stage, 7 to 11, and the formal operational stage, which is 12 and older. We'll look at pre-operational primarily for 2 to 7 years, as that's kind of the age range of our focus. So what are operations? Operations are kind of internalized sets of actions that we have. It's mentally adding and subtracting numbers. It's the way that we kind of develop that cognition from things that we've developed internally. We have thought that is symbolic, which is what we kind of hold in our mind. And if we make significant gains with our symbolic thought during preschool, so that would be that 2.5 to 6, which does have that overlap for kindergarten in Ontario. We're able at that point to form mental representation of things that we have thought about, things that we have learned within our minds as we moved through the preschool years. Our pre-operational thought are, even though we're using symbolic thought and using that as our mental representation in our memory, some things we can't think about logically. And this is why Piaget has theorized that we don't really have the logical thinking or the logical operations yet, which is that pre-operational thought. So that would be the operational, concrete operational or formal operational. But with pre-operational, we would hear children ask questions like, "Mommy, who was born first, you or me?" Logic would tell us that the mother was born first, but when a child is in that pre-operational thought, they're not thinking of that, and they're not thinking that would be the logical course of events, or that would be the logical process for that. Some of the limitations of pre-operational thought is that children cannot reverse a situation. They also center their attention on only one aspect or one thing. They cannot conserve. They are egocentric, and they have animistic thinking. For reversibility, this is the idea that preschoolers cannot understand reversing a process will restore the original condition. So in this case, an ice cube can melt into water and become an ice cube again if it is frozen. They don't understand the concept of 3 plus 2 equals 5, meaning 5 minus 2 would be 3. So this is the inability to reverse things and have the original state or condition restored. With centration, they focus on only one aspect of a problem, and it makes them difficult to understand cause and effect or understand different situations or transitions. So for example, when they see you as their educator, they cannot see you as an educator and anything else. So they can only focus on one thing. So this is why sometimes you may see a child that has been in your care out in public or in a store or on a walk, let's say, or at an amusement park, and the child will look at you almost shocked or stunned and be very, very surprised to see you anywhere but the childcare center or the school or wherever it is they're used to seeing you. So that's their inability to kind of see you as more than one thing. So they can only focus on you as a educator. You cannot be an educator and a person that goes to the mall and a person that, goes to, an amusement park, let's say. There's also the fact that they are not able to conserve. So they don't have an understanding of conservation and understanding that, liquid, even if it's in a different form. Let's say you have 1 cup of water and you put one, in a long dish and you put one in a tall glass. They don't understand, and Piaget's theory is they don't have the ability to understand that water is the same amount. And if you were to ask them which one is the same amount or which one is the correct amount, or the amount that has more, they would probably tell you the one in the long dish had more. Or maybe they would tell you the one in the tall glass had more. But the point is they would not understand that they were two of the same quantities or amounts of water in two different dishes, that it doesn't change the original amount and it doesn't change that they are the same. So for egocentrism, this is a child's inability to focus or understand anything that doesn't have to do directly with the child. So the child is only focused on anything from their own perspective. That would be the concept of egocentrism. So it's very hard for them to see anything from anyone else's perspective. Animism is when they kind of personify things that are not living, and they really have this basic knowledge that that things that don't move are not alive, but things that move are alive, right? So they may say everything is alive like they are. They may believe that. They may think that, it's kind of similar to the concept when we were talking about immanent justice, that it's just a belief, that's just how the world is, and we can't control that. So things don't move. If they don't move, then they're not alive. But if they move freely, then they believe that it's alive. For Lev Vygotsky, his thoughts are that we learn socially with interactions with other people, with interactions with different objects, and within our culture. We have talked about Lev Vygotsky's theory about the zone of proximal development, scaffolding, and we'll look more at language and thought and teaching strategies. So the zone of proximal development, we have spoken about the fact that it's the area between what a child can do on their own and what they need help with, and the scaffolding is what the educator might do, and we would do it in that zone of proximal development. That's where we would adjust the support that we provide to the child within that area. Language and thought, as described by Vygotsky, was this ability to self-regulate, to guide, to plan, to monitor your emotions through private speech. So you really reminding yourself or speaking to yourself or coaching yourself was considered something that Vygotsky saw as significant. So this was language, his thought about language and thought. However, Piaget thought that if you were needed inner speech, that it was kind of a sign of immaturity, where Vygotsky was pretty much opposite of that. For private and inner speech, this is when the child is now using adult guidance as their private speech in order to complete the task or activity. They have self-talk. This becomes like their second nature, something that they go to as a go-to to support when they're trying to complete more challenging tasks. They also internalize this egocentric speech in the form of that inner speech, which becomes their thoughts. So later, they don't have to have that private speech, they don't have to have the inner speech. It will become their thoughts. So they'll be able to complete the tasks without audibly speaking what their thoughts are. Information processing. The human mind is said to be like an information processor or a computer. And Vygotsky talked about this by the fact that when we perceive information, we encode it, we represent it, we store it, we retrieve the information, and that's how we kind of think. And it moves us into memory and the different types of memory we have. So when our information comes in, we have a sensory memory, we have a working memory, and then we have this long-term memory later on. Behaviorist approach. The behaviorist approach focuses on the belief that behaviors and what we observe in behaviors is what can be studied in terms of development. And that development is influenced by the environment and again is motivated by reward or punishment. The behaviorist theorists that we will look at is Ivan Pavlov and John Watson. And the key concepts of the behaviorist approach would be that learning is shaped by our environmental responses and how we respond to the environment. When we look at Ivan Pavlov, we see that he had an experiment, or he had a theory, rather, that was called classical conditioning. And he believed that when you pair a stimulus with another kind of response, you can kind of generate the behavior or the response that you are looking for or produce. So, for example, when the individual paired the ringing of a bell with food, the bell ringing later was removed, and the dog would salivate. And later on, when the bell was ringing and there was no food, the dog still continued to salivate. So basically, they paired the ringing of the bell to food. But prior to ringing the bell and showing the food, when they rang the bell individually, there was no response from the dog. So once they paired it, ringing of the bell, with the food, but then removed the food, as soon as the bell rang, the dog salivated. So it really, in their mind, put together the fact that the ringing of the bell would result in having food later on. The second theorist, John Watson, he believed that this idea of the classical conditioning would work on children. So conditioning would work on children. So having a stimulus, having kind of pairing it with something else, and then looking for a behavior, he believed that this would work on a child, and the child of choice was baby Albert. So the stimulus was a not allowed noise, and he was trying to prove that he can condition little Albert to have a behavior which would have been fear. So when he introduces an object, he would the little Albert would not be afraid, and then when he introduced the object with a loud sound, then baby Albert became afraid, and that is when the fear was conditioned, because when now the baby saw or heard the sound, they were afraid. Even though prior to that, they were not afraid of the object or sound. For multiple intelligence, Howard Gardner came up with the theory of multiple intelligence rather than general intelligence, which really focus more on how smart are you instead of how are you smart. And I say it in that way because with multiple intelligence, Gardner believed that you could be smart in a variety of different ways, and you could be smart by having more of kind of a predisposition to any one of, the 8 intelligence you see here. So with general intelligence, it's again measuring, how smart you are, like IQ and things like that. But with multiple intelligence, it's the different ways that you can be smart. So there's linguistic, there's logical, there's spatial, there's kinesthetic, there's musical, there's interpersonal, there's intrapersonal, and there's naturalistic.